dear listeners, welcome to the EdTech podcast, where we aim to improve the dialogue between ed and tech for better innovation and impact. This week, a huge congratulations to all of the team at Busuu, a UK-based language learning platform which has been acquired for €385 million by Chegg. We've been lucky enough to have one of the co-founders of Busuu, Bernard, on the show previously when I interviewed him in Beijing about AI and EdTech. And many of you will know Kirsten, who's also at Busuu and considered one of the stalwarts of UK EdTech, and very fun and lovely to boot too. So I'm so pleased for all of the team, and this is a great thing also for UK EdTech generally. We're hoping to get some of the Busuu team on the show in the new year to get the inside story on how all of that went down. And I hear that there may be more exciting EdTech news coming down the line for the UK sector, so do watch this space. What else? A huge thank you to Wisdom app, which alerted us to the fact that the EdTech podcast is considered to be in the top 2% of all the podcasts in the world. I'm still establishing the absolute metrics of all of this, but I think that audience downloads and the longevity of our show have a part to play. So thank you to Wisdom app, and if that is up your street and you or someone you know is into podcasting, then I'm also finalising my next course on how to commercialise a podcast. There were 900,000 podcasts launched in 2020, and so many of them suffer from pod fade after a bit. So I'm on a mission to help all those creators keep cash positive and to keep their shows going. So if that sounds of interest to anyone, please do share around. The course is all online and self-paced, and I'll share the link in the show notes. And it may be of interest to any university or further education college journalism courses too. What else? A new report came out this week from the Tony Blair Institute called Tech Inclusive Education, a World-Class System for Every Child. And the report shows that an additional 272 million new school places will be needed each year globally to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 4 of universal access to primary and secondary education. And the Institute advocates for using a minimum viable education system framework to pave the way for technology to radically improve access to high quality formal education. So some of the ideas they go on to talk about are introducing a lifelong digital learner ID issued at the start of compulsory education to give students control over their data and to improve accountability for schools and edtech providers and build a comprehensive picture of a child's learning. To also reorganise classrooms into cohorts and transform teaching career paths, providing students with access to varied learning activities and in-person support, and allowing trainee teachers to draw on the subject knowledge of more experienced colleagues as they work in teams, and to break the link between geography and educational opportunities and expand choice for pupils and parents by putting in place infrastructure and regulation for in-person remote schooling. And this is something that I'm personally very interested in and passionate about and working on at the moment in terms of rural and coastal communities. So it's all pretty cool, and we hope to get them on the show at some point. Not sure whether that will be Tony himself or one of the team, but yeah, very much looking forward to that. A big shout out to all the technology, engineering, creativity peeps down at C-Space in Newquay last night, who ran another excellent event, and to crowdfunders who are based down there and supported. As mentioned, I'm working on a new venture which I hope to reveal in the new year, and the group is instrumental in supporting female founders. Now, on to this week's show. This is the last episode before we wrap this year. We'll be back in January with author James Plunkett as our guest on the VocTech podcast series with UFI. And James's book End State is a Guardian Political Book of the Year, and James has some excellent insights on lifelong learning through his research and work at Citizens Advice as the Executive Director for Design, Data and Technology Policy and Advocacy, and his past work at both the Young Foundation and the Resolution Foundation. So I'm very much looking forward to that recording. So, dear listeners, that just leaves me to say thank you for another barnstorming year of the EdTech podcast. Your support is what makes working on the show excellent, and each edit that we go through totally worth it. So keep sending your feedback and I'll keep digging out top guests to make it worth listening in. Thank you also to this year's sponsors and media partners as well, without which we couldn't do any of this. And whatever your way of spending the holidays, have a great break. And if you fancy it, Merry Christmas. But now, get on with it, I hear you say. What's in this week's episode? Well, here's our recording for Reimagine Education Conference 2021. And this session is with Lumina Foundation and Lambda School, now known as the Bloom Institute of Technology, on pioneering new education models. That's it. Here we go. Welcome everyone to this session for Reimagine Education, which is looking at pioneering education models. A quick intro to our guests who we have today. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Courtney Brown, who is Vice President for Impact and Planning at the Lumina Foundation. Welcome. The Lumina Foundation is an independent private foundation committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all, with about $1.4 billion in assets and grants already allocated of over 250 million. Dr. Courtney says the biggest misunderstanding in higher education is who the students are. Most people believe those who are in higher education are 18 to 21, fresh out of secondary school. The reality, at least in the US, is almost 40% of today's students are over 25 and financially independent from their parents, and many are employed full-time. And I had a quick check, Courtney, and in the UK, the latest data was 2019 to 2020. But again, there were about 37% of all undergraduate entrants who were over 21 years of age. So slightly earlier, but still, perhaps slightly different to what we would imagine. And just finally, the Lumina Foundation works to ensure that 60% of adults will have a college degree, certificate, industry certification, or other credential of value by 2025. The next guest is Austin Allred, who is co-founder and CEO of Lambda School. Lambda School is an online coding and technical education program with an income sharing agreement model in which students pay tuition only after acquiring a job. Of a Wall Street Journal article that stated that 28% of bachelor's degrees do not have a net positive return and that more than a quarter of students are in programs that aren't worth the costs, Austin said it's time to fix that. Lambda grads are hired by companies of all sizes, including the Fortune 100 and the world's top startups, including companies like Google, Microsoft and Walmart. So welcome again, Austin and Courtney. So this session is all about exploring new partnerships and models which are challenging the status quo for the benefit of all. So Courtney, we've got relatively short time. I'll jump straight in with you. You have deep insight at Lumina Foundation into adult learning attainment across the whole of the US. I've been digging around in your data and it's really fascinating how you've kind of compiled that and the transparency that gives us all. And this shows who's benefiting and who's missing out. What's that research showing you? And with all this data, what are you actually investing in with Lumina Foundation as well? So which new models are piquing your interest?
So yes, at Lumina, we concentrate all of our efforts on ensuring adults, especially adults of color, have access to programs that lead to meaningful credentials, that they have financial and non-financial supports along the way to ensure their success, and that the credentials they earn lead to good jobs, higher pay, greater opportunity to learn and serve others. And at this point, especially in the US, but across the globe, even before the pandemic, higher education is in crisis for a number of reasons. And I think there are a few issues that we need to address to ensure that more people have access to post-secondary education. There's a supply issue, there's a demand issue, and we need to have more opportunities to increase access. So let me just touch on each of those fairly quickly. As far as the supply issue, in the last 10 years in just the US, capacity has grown 26%. So that includes more institutions, more dorm rooms, more labs by 26%. At the same time, demand, so those who are enrolling, has only grown by 3%. So our current system, our current higher ed system in the US is functioning only at about 75%, leaving roughly 5 million empty seats a year. And what that means is this underutilization means that we have empty classrooms, empty labs, empty beds, and those fixed costs have to be shared by fewer and fewer students every year. A recent research report we just did with EY Parthenon shows that that's the equivalent of about 50 billion US dollars a year that we are wasting on this mismatch between supply and demand. So one of the things that we have to address is the supply. Institutions are going to have to get brave. They're going to have to figure out who needs to merge, who needs to partner, and unfortunately, who needs to close because they're no longer serving students. They have too much capacity to serve those students. Secondly, we have to increase demand. Currently, there's a question about, is higher ed even worth it? You quoted some statistics and talked about some of Austin's work that people are completing and not having a credential of value. That could not be further from the truth. Data shows us that in the aggregate, people that have credentials of value, post-secondary credentials of value, have better lives, they make more money, and have better jobs than those without a post-secondary credential. So we need to change that narrative. We also need to make sure that we are serving today's students. As you mentioned, there are a lot of students who are over 25, who work full-time, who have their own children, their own dependents. Yet our current system does not serve those students. And finally, we need to open up new funding models for students to find other ways that they are actually able to access this increasing cost with post-secondary education. So even once we figure out that supply demand, get that equalized, we still need to find new opportunities to both help students financially and with some of the non-financial issues that they are dealing with.
That's a fantastic breakdown of the issues and how you're identifying what needs fixing. If I understand correctly, Lumina Foundation also invests in some of those different areas. Are there any particular models that are kind of more attractive to your mission than others?
Yeah, so some of the funding issues that we think about is the difference between merit-based aid and need-based aid. So a number of the states in the US, I think almost 23 states, still focus all their funding on merit-based aid, academic types aid, rather than need-based aid. And so we'd like to see that flipped, that it should be primarily about need-based aid. We'd also like to see that they are broadening who has access to aid. Currently, most of the systems focus on traditional age students. So it depends on how many years following secondary school. If you're not directly out of secondary school, you don't have access to aid. If you're not a full-time student, you don't have access to aid. If you don't live on the campus, you don't have access to full-time aid. And that's leaving behind tens of millions of current students and future students who don't have access to aid to actually participate in post-secondary education.
Austin, I wondered if you had any thoughts on the discussion around credentialing and the sort of value associated with either traditional forms of credentialing and new forms of credentialing as well.
I view it broadly as, if you look at higher education as a whole, that is a very, very broad bucket. I think what Courtney alluded to is correct, that by and large, the students who enter into higher education and get a credential are better off by a lot. But what we've seen is actually also what Courtney alluded to, that there are some instances where the costs have become so high and the return is low. In some circumstances, I think the Wall Street Journal just published a report on, I believe it was a master's program at USC, where the median amount of debt a student took out was $112,000 and the median salary was something like $52,000. So we view part of the problem is the incentive misalignment, especially in the United States. So USC, in that instance, suffers zero consequences of that being the case, and their only incentive is to enroll more and more students into that very expensive program. And I have nothing against a master's in social work per se, but I would argue, going $112,000 in debt in order to do so is not a healthy decision. So we think that schools should be more aligned with the incentives of the students, and we built our financing model around that. So, probably what Lambda School is most well known for is, we literally don't get paid tuition unless our students get a high-paying job on the other side. And that, that focuses what we do as a school, that focuses, how much we focus on outcomes. I don't think every program should be that way, and I don't think every school should be that way. But for a subset of the students who are, looking into post-secondary education, that is, the perfect solution. If you zoom out more broadly, what I think needs to happen is there are programs and institutions that don't make as much sense for students, and there are those that make a lot of sense for students. I think we need to do a better job of, at a minimum, helping students understand what that looks like. I view it as there's kind of a missing trade school, vocational school system in the United States. It exists in a lot of other countries. And, going to 4 years of a university and, taking out $100,000 plus in student loans is not the right solution for every student. And we need to be cognizant of that and provide more appropriate solutions for what a student is actually looking for.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Universities aren't just one size fits all. Some are more focused on research, some are larger than others. And students are going there for a variety of reasons. Not all employer aligned, but some are. I guess this session is all about educational models. And so I was sort of having a think about the different models that, like you say, have been developing since pre-pandemic. So there's things like the income sharing agreements and online boot camps that you're involved with Lambda, education as a benefit partnerships between colleges and employers like Guild Education, edutainment like Masterclass or spoken word audio and podcasts like Blinkist. And then services are now popping up more and more around digital learning nomads. So understanding the social benefits of learning in a group, but perhaps in quite a desirable location. And obviously all of this comes with a caveat of who can access these models. But I guess my question to you, Austin, would be what are the main benefits for these new educational models? And are there any drawbacks or teething pains as well?
Yeah, I think, broadly, at least in the United States, we have looked at the 4-year university for an 18-year-old as the only solution for higher education. Courtney alluded to this in some of the research, and I think you did as well, Sophie, that the median student at Lambda School is 31 years old from an age standpoint. And there's a kind of a bell curve around that. The university system was not built to serve 31, 32-year-old learners in most instances. And I think, there is a misunderstanding of who is attending universities. I fully agree with what you spoke about there. What we are broadly seeing is an unbundling of the university to where some schools are focused more on certain things. And really what I hope it results in is a proliferation of options for a student where, for one student, 4 years at a research institution when you're 18 is exactly what they want. For some institutions, we're really focused on providing the most direct, lowest risk path to a higher income that we can provide. That's not the goal of every student who enters a university. There are many, many different things that a university offers that we don't. So my hope is that a student can more exactly match what their needs are with what the offerings are over time, instead of looking at everything as this monolithic one way to do everything. 4 years when you're 18 years old institution. I think that's pretty healthy. And I expect that to continue in the future. When we started out in 2016, 2017, we were fully online. And at the time, we would encounter widespread beliefs that literally you could not teach people certain things online. But we also found that done the right way and with the right structure, you can have, almost all of the benefit. Obviously, if you want to go to parties and go to social events and, meet people, we do have, meetups for our students, but we're not the right place to go to if you're looking to primarily socialize. The internet experienced this broadly. If you think about, shopping in the mid 90s, there was a lot that the internet was lacking, and people couldn't imagine, not going into a bookstore or not going into a clothing store. And as online solutions get better, you can, replicate more and more of that or replace more and more of that. And there's still going to be things that you may want to do in person over time, and we may not be the best solution for those things. I think the most important thing for education is acknowledging when and where that's the case.
You've got different credentialing systems out there. In the past, people have stressed quite a lot about, how those stack up and whether you're, measuring apples and apples. What's your kind of take on that in terms of value that we're getting out of our education?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we need to focus on is transparency of all of these credentials. I would say the 4-year and 2-year institutions in the US have always had a little bit more scrutiny because they have had to be evaluated and accredited on a regular basis. Not that all of them are great, but there is a little bit more transparency there. The short-term credentials, the boot camps and whatnot, live in a little bit more of a black box. They may be provided by an employer, by a for-profit, and so we don't have apple-to-apple type of data. So we're really trying to uncover that so that we can make sure that students, because this should be a student-centered world, that they have access to, if I go get that credential, if I go get that master's in social work at USC, what's it going to cost me and what kind of salary can I expect coming out the other side? And are there people that look like me or have my experiences that actually participate there also? So we need more transparency so at least people know what they're getting when they go, buy something. For everything else that we purchase, we have these type of data. If I want to fly from here to London, I can look at all my opportunities and pay anywhere from $200 to probably $300,000, and knowing how long it's going to take me, how often they're on time, those sort of things. We don't have any of that in higher education. So we need more transparency. We developed something called the Credential Engine that is beginning to pull some of this information together from all types of credential, every credential that exists in the US right now. So that's one of the first things that we need to do. And, I think that the pandemic has given us an opportunity to refine, improve the virtual learning experience. And I think many 4-year and 2-year institutions who had never done it, dove in, and I applaud them for giving it a try and working to improve that. I hope that they don't go right back to everything has to be in person. I hope they continue to innovate and work on that. I also hope that our option won't be that you're either virtual or in person. We already have in the US a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots. And it's getting worse and worse. And a lot of that is defined by who has access to higher education, post-secondary education, and who does not. What I would hate to see is the have-nots only have access to virtual education, and the haves have in-person education and all those things that happen kind of maybe not outside of the classroom, beyond the parties and whatnot, but it's the conversations that take place at the end of the class. It's the conversations that take place as you're walking into the class or those sort of things. So we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to access education in all kinds of different ways and have access to mentoring and guided pathways and other things to help them get on track and stay on track.
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to you talk about that. It seems like there's a shift from the university defining educational experiences, and obviously that's diversified out into these different models. Whereas now there's a much stronger sort of student or learner voice in terms of being a consumer in all of this. So, we saw over the last 18 months that students taking universities to court because of their experiences online, and there's perhaps this greater scrutiny of the financial value of our educational experiences as well. And I know that other educational models are also under scrutiny, and I guess, is this partly because we're evolving out of sort of this one model where you paid a certain amount, and now there are many different models, many different fees, many different experiences of what value is, but perhaps we're quite new in this system as well. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on sort of new educational models, value, and sort of consumer voice and all of that as well.
Yeah, I think what you referenced earlier is in terms of making sure students have apples to apples comparisons of what to expect, what outcomes look like, all of that stuff. We spend a ton of time and money and effort. And actually, yesterday just put out another annual outcomes report, so students can look at that and can see what salary expectations are. They can see what time to graduation looks like. We have a relatively flexible model for time to graduation. They can see what job titles look like. And we also put out a diversity report that's, what does our student body look like? Where are they coming from? What are their backgrounds? And, you can map those two together. I think the best thing that educational institutions can do to aid in that is to produce data. I understand that it's a very difficult and complex thing to do. And it's far more difficult than people would expect to just know where your alumni are working and how much they're making, even for us, where that's the entire focus of our program. But I think the best thing we can all do is get more data, more clarity, and more options to all of the students.
I agree. Another thing we need to do is ensure that there's stackability with the different types of credentials. So oftentimes a short-term credential is a fabulous, and it could be one-stop shopping, that short-term credential is going to lead to a lifetime of great job and good salary. But oftentimes you need to stack that. And so we need to have a more clarity about what those skills are. I think, Austin, you raised the importance of skills, understanding what those competencies are and skills are that are within that credential so that it can stack to the next credential. So no one should have a dead end. We're constantly in the future going to need to upskill, reskill, skill. Nothing that we have right now is going to lead us through a lifetime job where we don't have to constantly learn. And so being able to stack on what we know and continue to learn is going to be absolutely essential. And that's up to institutions of post-secondary learning to be able to unpack that and say, here are the skills and competencies that you will be getting from these credentials.
And as ambassadors or enthusiasts for new models of learning, which increase accessibility and access to developing these skills, are there any sort of limitations to some of these models being rolled out more quickly? So I'm thinking of examples here in the UK where perhaps the regulation or the sort of state funding of some of these educational models, the existing legacy systems don't quite match up with the innovations that are happening. So I just wondered what your experience was and what you'd like to see more of in terms of creating a fertile ground for quality new education as well.
I have a lot of thoughts, some which I can share, some which I cannot. But yeah, certainly for us, we have a giant compliance team that is focused on just being in compliance with every state, because every state has completely different regulatory environment for higher education. And many of the laws did not contemplate online being a thing. There are very explicit laws around, how many students are in a classroom and what exactly their, instructor is like. And, in an online world, so much of that is so, even when you're trying to comply with the laws, you talk to the regulators and the regulators don't know, how to adjust that law. For example, in some states, there are laws around what you can teach across state lines from one state to another that were written to to solve for a tax avoidance problem, or a student saying, I am an in-state student in one state versus another. And so we have to comply with those because we are teaching in some instances in really every instance from one state into another. There are states where we have filing cabinets full of student data, despite the fact that we don't have an employee in that state. So we have to go rent an office and, put a filing cabinet that is under lock and key. And so the well-meaning regulation of, hey, you need to keep your student data available, but it needs to be locked down. Obviously that's written for an analog world. So I think, it's difficult to do, but my call would be for regulators to take a look at the regulations for education and see, does this make sense in 2021, or is this a law that's still on the books from 1970 when, a lot of what we're doing was literally not an option. And I think, Lambda School is lucky that we're, big enough and well-funded enough that we can do a lot of that. But for a lot of schools, their entire states, you just have to not teach in, because the compliance cost of teaching students in that state is so high. So I think that's the most glaringly obvious thing to solve for when it comes to how can we enable new education models.
So, Sophie, I would also say, there are so many different groups coming on and trying to sell their credentials. And that's concerning. It's concerning to me for the students who are paying for them and not getting a value from those, not getting being able to complete their credential or getting a credential of value. So we need to pay attention to that. And again, that goes back to the transparency. What is this credential? Because it sounds really good when you get a postcard for it and they're going to give you a free laptop. And it only costs $50 to enroll for your first class. Once you sign, lots of things change. So we need to pay attention to that. We also need to make sure that these credentials are aligned with employment needs, not just for the next 6 months, but beyond that. And so we, not that we need a crystal ball, but we need to have a little bit more thinking about the future and what kinds of skills are going to be needed in the future so that individuals are getting credentials that are not going to just end in 6 months. Their employment's not going to end, that they can have a greater lifetime with those.
I suppose if you were to leave this session and to leave anyone who's watching back or listening in, what would you like to leave with our listeners to kind of get them thinking deeply on this subject?
So I'll start. So I think one of the things that people need to acquaint themselves with, no matter where you are who today's students are. So who actually are the people that are attending post-secondary education, whether it is at a university for your kind of degree or whether it's a boot camp or what it is, to understand that, to dispel the myth that they're all 18 or 19 years old and their parents are paying. So I think that's really important. In the US, we have information on today's student on our website, Lumina Foundation. And I think that's important for policymakers, universities, colleges, any post-secondary provider to understand who you're supposed to be serving. And then I would say the role of colleges is to begin to use that information, and they're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to change. I'm not saying they're all going to go away, but in order to survive, you're going to have to figure out how to serve adults, how to serve the credentials of value that Austin is mentioning, and you were talking about, Sophie, because everyone doesn't need maybe a 4-year philosophy degree. Maybe they need a short-term credential that can then build on into a 4-year degree, or maybe they need a 4-year degree and then they're going to need to top it off with a certificate or a certification afterwards. So colleges of tomorrow are going to have to be more adaptable and figure out what students need, not at one point in time, but throughout their lifetime, and figure out how to serve them better.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think the answer was broadly correct. Understand student needs better and adapt. I think a lot of colleges have been lucky enough to be in a world where, with expanding populations and expanding, if you look compared to the 80s, more and more students going to college, you didn't really have to adapt for a long time. And I think the role of higher education is shifting somewhat. the funding will shift, the population demographics will shift. And at the end of the day, the needs of the students will shift. And so I think that the schools that are most responsive to the needs of the student and the needs of the market are those that will win. I don't know that every school is going to be able to make that transition. For a lot of colleges, that's an incredibly difficult transition, and one that has not had to have been made for a very long time. But I think at the end of the day, schools are going to come out stronger from this. Educations are going to be stronger. Students will be better served now than they have been in the past. And I expect that trend to continue. So I'm actually very optimistic for the schools that are willing to that are figuring out how to become agile and respond to student needs. I think they're in a great spot.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. If people want to go and find out more, so Lumina Foundation, Lambda School, thank you again for sharing your insights, and look forward to sharing this. And that's the end of this week's episode. As always, a huge thank you to all of my guests, Reimagine Education for putting on an excellent event, and to all of you for listening in. If you're feeling the season of goodwill, go and give us a rate and review, or contact us about sponsorship in 2021. Whatever you do over this time before 2022, hope that you get to spend some quality time with friends and family. And the EdTech podcast will be back in 2022. See you then. Bye-bye.